Welcome to Part 5 of Murder and Marriage. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for an awesome collection of unique, full-length audiobooks. And be sure to subscribe to be notified when new books are released. Chapter 13. Preliminary Skirmishing. Franklin McDermott looked quizzically at Inspector Cowser as he gestured for him to take a seat in the library. He then shifted his attention to Detective Sergeant Brown, but the sergeant's unyielding expression offered no insights. Returning his gaze to Cowser, McDermott felt a sense of unease. "Please have a seat, Mr. McDermott," Cowser instructed. Settling into a chair across from McDermott, he appeared imposing, while Sergeant Brown leaned his solid frame against a nearby sofa, observing silently. "Now, can you explain why you skipped the inquest for John Norby?" "I didn't skip it," McDermott replied, defensively. "Is that so? It seemed that way to us at headquarters," Cowser remarked, taking pleasure in McDermott's visible irritation. He knew that a man on edge might reveal something useful, and it's been clear that you've avoided talking to us since then. "What's the issue with that?" McDermott adjusted his position, seeming more relaxed. "Inspector, why dwell on the past? Now that I have the time, I'm happy to answer any questions you have, as long as there's something I can respond to," he added with a smile that tried to convey charm. "Of course," Cowser replied dryly. "Why did you leave 10 Acres so suddenly after John Norby signed those papers on Sunday night?" "My actions were not sudden," McDermott said, a slight frown forming on his face. "I had work to attend to at home, so I left, planning to return to 10 Acres in time for breakfast on Monday morning." "But you didn't come back, did you?" "No, I overslept." The explanation felt too convenient, and Cowser's eyes hardened with suspicion. "When did you first find out about John Norby's murder?" he pressed. "I learned of his death," emphasizing the last word, "on Monday just before noon." "And who told you about Norby's murder?" Cowser's emphasis on the word made McDermott's cheeks flush. "Colonel Julian Hull, my senior partner, shared the news with me," he replied. "His daughter, Miss Stephanie Hull, had called him. I didn't realize until last night, when I visited the Hulls, that the police thought John Norby's death was murder rather than suicide." "And what do you think about it?" Cowser asked. McDermott shrugged. "I haven't formed any theories," he replied. "The whole situation is terribly tragic. It seems unbelievable that John would take his own life, but for anyone who knew his kind nature, as I did," he said, looking directly at Cowser, "it's impossible to believe that someone could have killed him." "Impossible, perhaps, but he was murdered," Cowser said grimly, "and we intend to find the killer. What time did you leave 10 Acres on Sunday night, and did John Norby know you were leaving?" McDermott shook his head. "No, I left just before midnight." "Without informing Mrs. Marshall Norby, or anyone else in the house?" "Mrs. Norby had already gone to bed," McDermott replied. "Starnes and Damison, the Filipino chauffeur, knew I was leaving." "Why didn't you tell Mr. Jackson you were leaving?" McDermott frowned at the inspector's persistence. "It was after we had parted that I suddenly decided to go home that night. There was no reason to disturb Jackson," he stated coldly. Cowser glanced at his notebook, where he had jotted down notes during their discussion. "Do you know Mr. Jackson well?" he asked. "We're friends, yes," McDermott answered, and Cowser raised an eyebrow at the brief response. "You just said, Mr. McDermott, that only Starnes and Damison knew of your departure," he continued. "At the inquest, Miss Brandi Norby testified that she saw you on your way out." Yes, I forgot. I did see her," McDermott interjected quickly. "And you told her about the prenuptial agreement and the codicil to Norby's will, which you witnessed him sign." Cowser paused before asking, "Wasn't that breaking a confidence, sir?" "Absolutely not. Norby didn't ask us to keep it a secret," McDermott shot back. Cowser studied McDermott's flushed face for a moment in silence. "How was Miss Norby dressed?" he asked. McDermott fidgeted uncomfortably at the question. "I really can't say," he muttered. She was dressed appropriately, if that's what you mean. I never doubted that, Cowser replied, a hint of disgust creeping into his tone. But how was she dressed, Mr. McDermott? Did she wear the gown from dinner, or did she have on a street suit? I don't know, he replied sullenly. It was dark. Dark where? Inside or outside? McDermott's gaze flicked between Cowser and Sergeant Brown, who had just approached them, then back to Cowser. What difference does it make to you, Inspector? McDermott challenged. It's my concern, Cowser shot back roughly. Now I demand a direct answer. Where did you meet Miss Norby on Sunday night? When McDermott remained silent, Cowser pressed on urgently. Was it inside the house or outside? Answer me right now. Outside the house, McDermott said, his tone sulky. Outside is too vague, Mr. McDermott, Cowser persisted. Did you meet Miss Brandi near the servants' wing, underneath the window of Gretchen's bedroom? That's none of your business. McDermott jumped to his feet, anger flashing in his eyes. I require an answer, Mr. McDermott. You won't get one, he said with a sneer. If I have more to say, it will be to your superiors and in front of my lawyer. If you intend to take that stance, Mr. McDermott, Cowser rose too, I will have no choice but to serve you with a subpoena to appear as a material witness at the next inquest hearing. A startled expression crossed McDermott's face before it vanished. Colonel Hull told me the inquest was over. For yesterday afternoon, Cowser said, as he put away his notebook and fountain pen. The next hearing will be Thursday at 2 o'clock at the district morgue. I strongly suggest you remember to attend, he said, emphasizing his point. One more thing, where did you spend all of Sunday night? McDermott's bright complexion drained away, leaving his skin looking sickly yellow. What the hell? He yelled, his voice quickly softening as Starnes pulled back the curtains and entered the library. The butler bowed respectfully. Luncheon is served, he announced. Miss Brandi and Dr. Curtis are already at the table, and Miss Stephanie is waiting for you in the hall. He threw a word over his shoulder that Cowser could not decipher as McDermott rushed into the reception hall. Inspector Starnes, with a subtle nod to Starnes, opened the French window to the veranda, and followed by his loyal partner, Sergeant Brown, strode across the lawn toward the lodge. Luncheon, as Curtis perceived it, turned into a long and trying affair. No one but Stephanie was in the mood for conversation. When dessert arrived, she shot an annoyed glance at her cousin, which Brandi completely missed, and eventually fell silent. The unsettling scene in the hall and the discovery of the discolored scalpel weighed heavily on Curtis's mind, and Brandi's distracted replies and lackluster demeanor did nothing to ease his anxiety. He did his best to handle Stephanie's attempts at conversation. In contrast, Franklin McDermott happily enjoyed the excellent meal, speaking only in brief replies, if he spoke at all. As they left the table, McDermott nudged closer to Brandi and gestured for her to wait. She shot a quick look at Stephanie and Curtis, who had already moved toward the hall, then turned back to face him with noticeable reluctance. "What is it?" she asked. "Why are you avoiding me?" he asked bluntly. Brandi felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I thought we were supposed to take a drive together this morning." "With Stephanie along," he interrupted, his tone as aggressive as ever. "You've been avoiding me." "I have not." Brandi's eyes flashed with anger. "And let's be clear," she added with pointed emphasis, "I haven't run away." It was McDermott's turn to flush. "I need to speak with you alone," he insisted, raising his voice. Starnes, busy clearing away the dessert plates, glanced over with open interest. The servants at 10 Acres did not like McDermott. His arrogant demeanor and total disregard for them explained his unpopularity. They accepted his generous tips with polite gratitude, but secretly resented his presence in the house. McDermott's attention to Stephanie had given Starnes a theory about Norby's multiple dinner invitations and social events. The butler had begun to doubt Norby's attachment to the young stockbroker, having witnessed a few heated exchanges between them. McDermott had made derisive comments at the dinner table about bread and butter misses. and yet he suddenly seemed to favor Brandi's company. Her innocent perspective on life and her bright, cheerful nature had won her the admiration of the servants. Intrigued, Starnes lingered in the dining room, hoping to overhear their conversation, but his hopes were quickly dashed. "I hear the doorbell, Starnes," Brandi said, turning her back on McDermott to address the butler. With a glance over her shoulder, she added, her voice laced with scorn, "There's no need for us to be alone, Franklin." "Isn't there?" His laughter was harsh. "What if, instead of having a nice chat with you, I went to the police?" Brandi clenched her hands around her handkerchief. Without responding, she hurried into the hall just as her mother entered through the front door with Sam Jackson. "Have you eaten, Mother?" she asked, as Suzanne appeared to greet Mrs. Norby's wraps were taken by Starnes, as he relieved the lawyer of his overcoat and hat. "I had a salad and a cup of coffee at the Shoreham," Mrs. Norby replied. "What about you, Sam?" "No lunch for me, thanks." Jackson picked up his leather briefcase and glanced at Mrs. Norby. "Shall we get down to business?" "That would be best." Mrs. Norby took off her hat and handed it to Suzanne. She paused in front of the hall mirror to check her hair, giving it a quick fix here and there before turning to her daughter. "Come into the library, Brandi. Where is Stephanie?" "She's already in the library, Mother." "In that case," Mrs. Norby started toward the library, but stopped as Franklin McDermott appeared from the dining room, where he had been watching them just inside the door. "Ah, Franklin, good morning." As he returned her greeting and stepped forward to join her in the library, she waved him off. "I'm afraid you'll have to excuse us," she explained. "Mr. Jackson is here to read Mr. Norby's will, and only family is allowed to be present." With a graceful bow, she moved past McDermott. He tried to catch Brandi's eye, but she walked by with her head turned away, focusing on what Jackson was saying on her right. McDermott bit his mustache, hesitated uncertainly, then ignored Suzanne's quiet apology as he brushed past her, opening the front door and stepping out onto the veranda. When Mrs. Norby entered, Curtis rose from his seat by Stephanie and turned to her. "Why, Cousin Belle, I didn't hear you come back," exclaimed Stephanie, jumping up. "We should have held lunch for you," she added, with a disapproving glance at Brandi. "I told Brandi not to wait," Mrs. Norby said. "While Sam was going through papers in his office, I stepped over to the Shoreham for a bite to eat. Now, Sam, please go ahead." Jackson pulled out a small card table and set his briefcase on it. "I have here," he began, "the last will and testament of John Norby. It was signed by Norby in my office a year ago and has been in my care since then. Today, in the presence of the necessary officials, I have taken it from my vault and brought it here to read in front of John Norby's family." "Just a moment, please." Curtis stepped forward and addressed Mrs. Norby. "I'm afraid my presence is an intrusion, if you'll allow me to withdraw." "Please wait, Doctor." A flush of color rose to Mrs. Norby's cheeks, and a smile, which Brandi would later remember as both lovely and charming, brightened her dark eyes. "My daughter would surely prefer to have you here." Curtis hesitated, unsure if he was truly wanted. "Please stay." Brandi's gentle voice eased his doubts, and he settled back into his seat as she moved closer and sat down beside Stephanie on the sofa. Jackson picked up a document that he had just taken from his briefcase, watching the interaction between Mrs. Norby and the blind surgeon. But his reading of the will was soon interrupted. The curtains were thrust aside as Colonel Julian Hull strode into the library unannounced. "Why wasn't I notified, Belle?" he demanded. "As John's first cousin, I have the right to be present at the reading of his will." "Stephanie spoke for you," she replied coldly. "Who told you, Julian, that the will was being read?" "What difference does that make to you?" he scowled. "Go on, Jackson." And without a word to anyone else, he flopped down into the nearest chair. As Jackson's deep voice continued, Brandi felt as if she would never escape the endless stream of whereas, and because, that littered each page of the document. When he finished, Jackson laid the will on the table and reached for another, heftier manuscript. "This," he explained, "is the complete list of special bequests of Mr. Norby's personal belongings, as mentioned in his will. Would you like it read aloud?" No, Colonel Hull was on his feet, his eyes flashing with anger. I've heard enough. According to that document, Jackson, Brandi Norby is bequeathed $1 million and 10 acres. The rest of his fortune is going to charities, while my daughter Stephanie receives a measly $100,000 and a diamond necklace. What? He snapped, turning to glare at Mrs. Norby and her daughter. What have you done with the codicil that John signed on Sunday night, the one that revoked the $1 million gift to Brandi and gave that sum to Stephanie instead? Mrs. Norby straightened up with poise. Your tone is completely uncalled for, she replied, but before she could say more, Sam Jackson interrupted, his expression serious and displeased. We all know that the codicil and prenuptial agreement have gone missing, he pointed out. When I left John on Sunday night, those documents were on his bed, and Stephanie was with him. Stephanie paled at her father's look. They were still on the bed when I went to my room just minutes after you left, Sam, she said, her voice trembling. Do you really think Stephanie would hide a document that granted her $1 million? Colonel Hull scoffed, even as he asked. The idea is ridiculous. It's no more ridiculous than suggesting that someone here is responsible for its disappearance, Mrs. Norby shot back, her spirit undeterred. You're overstepping, Julian. I will fight for Stephanie's rights, Colonel Hull declared, his anger boiling over. That will not go through probate without a challenge. Jackson placed the will and its related documents back in his briefcase, carefully closing and locking the leather flap. Slipping the key into his pocket, he faced the furious stockbroker. This document will be filed with the Registrar of Wills immediately, he stated. You can take whatever action you see fit. Turning to Mrs. Norby, he added, I'm heading to my room now, Mrs. Norby, and I'll be back at my office within an hour. Is there anything I can do for you and Brandi? Nothing, thank you, Mrs. Norby responded warmly, except for you to return in time for dinner. I'll discuss things with you then, she said, offering a friendly farewell nod. As Jackson, offering a reassuring word to Brandi, who sat in a daze, passed by Curtis, he tapped the blind surgeon on the shoulder. Come to my room, he whispered, and without waiting for Curtis to respond to Mrs. Norby, slipped out of the room just as Colonel Hull and his visibly upset daughter moved into the seldom-used drawing-room. Curtis was quick to follow Jackson to his bedroom. What's this about, Jackson? He asked, as the lawyer closed the door and half-dragged him over to the window seat. There's been a new development, the lawyer replied sharply. You remember this inventory, he said, pulling a sheet of paper from his wallet. It's the document we found in John's desk that has the note in his handwriting, contents of safe deposit box belongs to. Yes, I remember, Curtis said impatiently, noting the lawyer's pause. The name must have been cut off. Go on. We opened the safe deposit box this morning with the officers from the Metropolis Bank and court officials present, Jackson said, his excitement barely contained. It was a large box. And what did you find inside? Curtis asked eagerly. Norby, Will. No, I had that in my office vault. Curtis sat up straighter, turning his sightless gaze toward his companion. Did you locate the missing documents? No, neither of them. Jackson spoke deliberately. The box was empty except for this key, and he placed it in Curtis's hand. In stunned silence, Curtis felt the grooves and notches before tracing the name stamped on it in raised letters. A Yale key, he said. Was there a linen tag attached? Yes, Jackson lowered his voice to nearly a whisper. The tag says, in Norby's handwriting, just one word, duplicate. Chapter 14. The Duplicate Key. David Curtis held the Yale key in his hand, deep in thought. So this key was the only thing in Norby's safe deposit box, he asked. That's right, Jackson said, lighting a cigar and taking a long puff. Pretty strange, isn't it? Why did Norby keep the key in such good condition? It could have been left there by mistake. True enough. The lawyer pointed at the inventory sheet resting on the window ledge. It says here, contents of safe deposit box belongs to. He folded the paper up and slipped it back into his wallet. What do you think? There are no contents. Other than this key, Curtis finished. But a key has to match a lock. He smiled. So it's clearly your job, Jackson, to find the lock. You think, Jackson looked at him sharply as he paused, that we might find what's missing from the safe deposit box behind the lock this key opens, Curtis clarified. I say might, remember, not will, and it's just a guess for now. Jackson looked frustrated. What do you expect me to do? He grumbled. Inspector Cowser and I have already searched every desk and drawer in Norby's bedroom and library. We didn't find anything out of the ordinary, just what you'd expect from a wealthy man. Norby, at first glance, seemed to have his finances in order. Curtis hesitated for a moment. This key is marked duplicate, he said finally. Do you remember seeing the original among Norby's keys? I can't say I do, Jackson admitted, but there were quite a few Yale keys on his ring. Did you find a lock for every key that was there? That's a good point, Jackson said, his expression brightening. But I'm not sure I can answer that right away. Cowser has the keys. Let's see if he's still around. Setting his cigar down, Jackson rushed across the room to the house phone. It took him a moment to get a response to his call. Hello, hello, he shouted. Who's there? Tiasca, Jackson finally recognized the Filipino's halting English. Where can I find Inspector Cowser? Is he at the lodge? Hurry over and ask him to come back here, Tiasca. Tell him Mr. Jackson wants to see him. Wait a moment, Tiasca, he called as the man began to disconnect his call. Bring Inspector Cowser to Mr. John Norby's bedroom. After placing the receiver back on the phone hook, Jackson noticed Curtis standing by the door, waiting for him. The two men stepped into the hallway and made their way toward Norby's room. As they walked, Gretchen darted down the hall toward the servants' quarters, hesitating for a moment to cast a worried glance at the backs of the two men. Then, retracing her steps, she slipped silently down the corridor towards Stephanie Hull's room. He narrowly missed crossing paths with Inspector Cowser and Tiasca as they ascended the circular staircase. The Filipino had acted swiftly on Jackson's command and intercepted the inspector just as he was about to get into a police car driven by Detective Sergeant Brown, which was parked beneath the trees near the entrance to 10 acres. Inspector Cowser listened intently as Jackson recounted finding the inventory sheet with its note about a safe deposit box and the discovery of the duplicate key. Is that the only box Norby had at the bank? He inquired. No, Jackson replied. He had another one, which we opened today in front of the appropriate authorities. It held the securities, jewelry, and other valuables listed in Norby's memorandum of special bequests. We verified everything this morning, and it was all there. Do you think this note refers only to the box that contains the duplicate key? Cowser asked. That's my impression, yes, Jackson confirmed. Did you think to ask the bank officials when Norby rented the, shall we say, second box? Curtis interjected. Jackson nodded eagerly. Yes. The box that held the securities he had owned for nearly 10 years was overshadowed by the smaller box he had just rented 4 weeks ago. Jackson looked directly at Cowser. That box costs $25 a year to rent. Why would Norby pay that much just to keep a duplicate key in it? He might have planned to store other valuables there, suggested the inspector, pulling several bunches of keys from a chamois bag he had taken from an inside pocket. He spread the keys across the table, then picked them up one by one, pairing each key with the one marked with a linen tag that read, duplicate, in clear handwriting. The inspector was meticulous, and Curtis found himself growing impatient as he waited for him to finish. This Yale key doesn't match any of the ones we have, Cowser remarked more seriously, now recognizing the importance of Jackson's thoughts about the duplicate key. And these are the only keys we found in this bedroom, the library, and in the pockets of Norby's clothing. Did you check the pocket of Norby's pajamas? Curtis asked. There was nothing but a handkerchief in there, Cowser replied. If you don't mind, Mr. Jackson, I'll keep this key and have Sergeant Brown and an assistant search for its mate. And the locket fits, Curtis added quickly, as the inspector, taking Jackson's approval for granted, began to put the keys back into the chamois bag, holding on to the one in question with his right hand. "Don't worry, we'll conduct a thorough search," Cowser responded, not too pleased with Curtis's tone. He brushed past the blind surgeon and stepped into the hall first, with the others following closely behind. "Where is that miserable parrot of Mr. Norby?" "It's not in his old bedroom." Tiaska, who had been lingering near the top of the circular staircase, overheard the question. He kept one eye on the closed door where the three men were gathered, and the other on the front hall below. "Miss Brandi has ruffles," he chimed in as he approached them. "The bird cries so much, and Miss Brandi told me, 'Tiaska, bring ruffles to my room.'" "Oh," Cowser scratched his head, uncertainty clear on his face. "Make sure the bird doesn't leave the house, Tiaska. By the way, didn't you take care of Mr. Norby?" "I handled his clothes and his room, yes, sir," Tiaska replied. "I always run errands for him, and I wait at the table under Starnes, yes, sir." "Do you recognize this key?" Inspector Cowser asked, holding it up close to Tiaska's face. "Do you know what it opens?" Tiaska examined the key closely, turning it over in his hands, his expression carefully neutral as he felt the linen tag. "I haven't seen it before," he said, handing it back. "Have you seen one similar?" Curtis asked, breaking his silence. "Perhaps," Tiaska answered without committing. "Mr. Norby always kept his keys under his pillow at night. Sometimes," he glanced at each man in turn, "Mr. Norby would forget them in the morning and ask me to fetch them." "Can you positively identify this as one that Mr. Norby had?" Cowser pressed. "Honorable sir," Tiaska stepped back slightly to let Cowser pass and bowed low to the inspector. "It looks like most any key from Mr. Norby's. What do you call it? Bunch. You see for yourself. You have the keys." Cowser took this as a simple statement, but to Curtis's sharp ears, it sounded more like an interrogation. "So you don't know what this key opens?" The inspector held it out for a moment before slipping it into his pocket. "All right, Tiaska, you can go now." He turned to Jackson. "Goodbye, sir. I'll stop by later this afternoon." "Wait," Curtis said, placing a hand on Cowser's shoulder. "About that scalpel," he hesitated. "Have you found out anything?" "Not yet, but I'm absolutely sure it was used to kill Norby." Jackson stepped forward. "You found the weapon," he exclaimed, rushing down the steps after Cowser. "How, where?" "Come on, and I'll show you," Cowser called over his shoulder, not waiting for the others to catch up. He headed toward the front door. Curtis hesitated for just a moment, then slid his cane under one arm, grasped the banister, and hurried to keep pace with his more energetic companions. As their heads disappeared down the staircase, Tiaska took a deep breath. After glancing up and down the quiet corridor, he walked to Mrs. Marshall Norby's boudoir door and knocked softly. At his second tap, he heard Mrs. Norby's brisk voice say, "Come in," and he stepped inside, shutting the door gently behind him so it wouldn't slam. "You called for me, madam?" he inquired. "Yes." Mrs. Norby pushed her chair back from her desk and regarded Tiaska through her gold lorgnettes. "I've already informed Starnes and the other servants that according to Mr. Norby's will, my daughter inherits 10 acres, she stated, noting that the door connecting her boudoir to Brandi's bedroom was firmly closed. "Miss Brandi is still a minor, and I am her legal guardian. So you understand, Tiaska, that keeping your position in this house depends on your loyalty to me." "Yes, madam." "I find you satisfactory so far." "I don't understand why you're hesitating now," she said sharply. Tiaska stood before her, shifting nervously from one foot to the other, his face flushing a deep yellow under her fierce gaze. "Do you understand?" she pressed again, irritation clear in her voice. "Yes, madam. You want me to look for a particular key in Mr. Norby's bedroom," he replied, taking a small step closer. "The detective has one just like it." Mrs. Norby went pale beneath her makeup. "And you did not obtain it from him." "Please have patience, madam. It might prove challenging." Tiaska was carefully choosing his words, making a clear effort with his English. "I take it you're asking for a bribe," she said, as she opened her handbag, removing a gold coin and offering it to him. "Do you have any news?" "No, madam," he replied humbly, then added as an afterthought, "Starnes told me that Mr. McDermott tried to see Miss Brandi alone." Their eyes locked, and Mrs. Norby spoke first. "Thank you, Tiaska. You can leave now." But Tiaska remained where he was. "Please, madam, is Miss Brandi going to marry the blind doctor?" Mrs. Norby regarded him with clear disapproval. "My daughter's personal matters are not up for discussion," she said coldly. "That will be all, Tiaska." As the door clicked shut behind the departing servant, Mrs. Norby turned back to her desk, her brow furrowed in thought. Was her obedient tool becoming restless? Meanwhile, Tiaska reached the ground floor just in time to open the front door as the bell rang. A stranger stood on the threshold. "May I see Mr. Samuel Jackson?" he asked. "I was informed at his office that he was here." Looking past the stranger, Tiaska spotted Jackson approaching along the gravel path, accompanied by Dr. Curtis. "There he is," Tiaska exclaimed. "Right behind you, sir. You might want to join him." The stranger, glancing with mild surprise at Tiaska, turned around and descended the steps, making his way to Jackson and Curtis, who had paused under the pergola. "Mr. Jackson," he inquired, lifting his hat slightly. "My name is Elliot, Frank Elliot from Chicago. Your clerk sent me out here since my time in Washington is limited." He hesitated briefly. "I understand you were John Norby's lawyer and are now an executor of his estate as outlined in his will." "That is correct," Jackson replied as the visitor paused. "Allow me to introduce Dr. David Curtis, Mr. Elliot." Elliot eyed the blind surgeon with some curiosity as they shook hands. "I need to speak with you, Mr. Jackson, about an important matter concerning Norby's estate. It requires your immediate attention." "Excuse me," Curtis interjected. "Perhaps I should step aside." "No," Jackson countered before Elliot could respond. "Dr. Curtis is engaged to marry Miss Brandi Norby, the main beneficiary of her uncle's will, thus." "I can speak in front of him," Elliot insisted. He stroked his clean-shaven chin and cleared his throat, clearly struggling to express the reason for his visit to 10 Acres, a fact that Curtis noticed from the quickness of his breath. "I'm part of a group of men," Elliot began, letting his hand drop from his chin to the watch fob, which he absently stroked. "We're openly opposing prohibition and have joined forces." "By interests, you mean money?" Curtis asked quietly, and Elliot's gaze sharpened. He had been focusing solely on the lawyer until now. "Yes, money," he admitted. "We entrusted John Norby with this money to bank on our behalf." "When did this happen?" Curtis pressed. "To be precise, it was exactly 4 weeks ago today," Elliot replied. "I came here personally and witnessed Norby place the money in his safe deposit box." Jackson's excitement grew as he stared at Elliot. Curtis adjusted his grip on his cane, stepping closer to the stranger. "Do you remember the number of the safe deposit box in the bank?" he inquired. "I do remember the bank. It was the Metropolis Bank." "But Norby didn't tell me the box number," Elliot replied. "What I do know is that he rented it that very morning specifically to hold our funds." Jackson tried to speak twice, but hesitated, glancing uncertainly at his blind companion. Elliot was also focused on Curtis, and it would have taken someone sharper than the little lawyer to interpret his expression. "Mr. Elliot," Curtis lowered his voice to a more personal tone, "would you mind sharing the amount of money you entrusted to John Norby?" "I don't mind at all," Elliot answered, his hearty tone slightly softened. "It was $100,000 in cash." Chapter 15. Hull, her weariness forgotten as she studied the young woman. "That dress suits you beautifully, and your hair looks exquisite." Gretchen blushed at the compliment, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. "Thank you, Miss Hull. I try to keep it neat." She took a sip of water from the glass in her hand, letting the cool liquid refresh her before setting it down on a nearby table. "I trust all is well in the city?" Mrs. Hull asked, shifting in her seat to face Gretchen more directly. The last rays of sun cast a warm glow on the veranda, making the scene feel cozy. "It is, indeed," Gretchen said, her tone brightening. "But it does seem to grow hotter every summer. I sometimes wish for a breeze like we have here." She gestured to the gentle rustling of leaves in the trees surrounding them. Mrs. Hull nodded, appreciating the serene beauty of 10 acres. "It's a true haven, far removed from the bustle. You're fortunate to work in such a splendid place." Gretchen smiled softly, a hint of pride in her expression. "I do love it here. The gardens, the house, everything feels alive with stories." "Indeed," Mrs. Hull replied, her gaze drifting toward the garden again. "But not all stories are pleasant, are they? This place holds its share of secrets." A moment of silence followed as both women absorbed the weight of those words, each lost in her own thoughts. Finally, Gretchen broke the stillness. "May I bring you a little something to eat? It might help you feel better after your journey." "Only if it's not too much trouble, dear," Mrs. Hull replied, her voice warm. "A light snack would be delightful." Gretchen stood up, eager to help, the fabric of her dress swaying softly as she moved. "I shall be right back." As she left, Mrs. Hull turned her gaze back to the garden. She caught sight of the men emerging once again from the trees at the edge of the grounds. David Curtis was unmistakable. His tall stature and distinctive cane gave him away immediately. Alongside him was Sam Jackson, the other man still a mystery. The sight pricked her interest, but she quickly dismissed her curiosity. It was not her place to pry into the affairs of men. With a deep breath, she settled back into her chair, welcoming the peace of the evening as she waited for Gretchen's return. Hull, eyeing her with admiration, said, "You've filled out since you arrived from Europe with Miss Stephanie, and it suits you well." She quickly noticed that Gretchen seemed to think the comment was questionable. "Thank you, madame," Gretchen replied, giving a charming curtsy, one of her foreign quirks, as Starnes liked to call it. He had been discouraged early on from paying too much attention to the young Dutch girl, and his fondness for her had, as often happens, faded into disinterest. He had returned to courting Suzanne, hoping the sharp-witted French girl hadn't noticed his fleeting affections for the attractive newcomer. If Suzanne had caught wind of his sudden interest in the lovely stranger, she showed no signs of it, and life at 10 acres had settled into its familiar rhythm. "Do you enjoy it here, Gretchen?" Mrs. Hull asked, shifting her gaze from the girl to the sprawling views of the garden. The gentle greens of late spring were soothing to her eyes, and she didn't mind the prolonged silence before she received a response. "Oh, yes, madame, it's very nice," Gretchen said. "Would you like another drink?" "No, no, thank you." Mrs. Hull pulled her handkerchief from her bag. "If you ever decide to leave, which seems possible now, remember you must come to us, Gretchen. I'll always keep a place for you." "You are very kind, madame." "Not at all. Miss Stephanie adores you, and we all do," Mrs. Hull replied. "Is that Tiaska coming out of the maze?" As she asked, Mrs. Hull handed the empty glass back to Gretchen, her gaze fixed on the girl's face. Gretchen's eyes were focused on the man Mrs. Hull had just noticed, and a deep blush colored her cheeks. Surprised by this reaction, Mrs. Hull reiterated her question. "No, no, madame, it is Damison," Gretchen stammered. "Will you come inside?" "Is Miss Stephanie at home?" "Yes, madame." "Then run along and ask her to come out here," Mrs. Hull instructed. "And Gretchen, you need not mention to Mrs." Hull's expression shifted as she processed this information, her brow furrowing in distress. Contesting it, he cannot be serious. "He is dead serious," Stephanie insisted. "He believes he can overturn the decision with enough pressure." "Pressure on whom?" Mrs. Hull asked, her voice rising slightly, revealing her concern. "On the lawyers, on Brandi. He thinks if he creates enough of a fuss, they will bend to his will." "That's madness, Stephanie. It will only cause more trouble." "I know, Mother," she said softly, her tone pleading. "But you know how he is. Once he makes up his mind, there's no changing it." Mrs. Hull shook her head, her expression one of disbelief mixed with fear. We can't let him do this. It will ruin everything. Father's determined, Stephanie replied quietly, glancing toward the house as if expecting him to appear. He sees Brandi as a threat to our future, and he's willing to do anything to get what he wants. I pray he doesn't drag us into a scandal, Mrs. Hull murmured, her voice heavy with worry. With a supportive squeeze of her mother's hand, Stephanie leaned in slightly, her eyes determined. We must stand by one another. Whatever happens, we stay united. Hull stirred restlessly in her chair. Why does Julian act without thinking? She exclaimed. He wanted to protect my rights. Mrs. Hull seemed at a loss for words, if not entirely convinced. It took a full 5 minutes before she found her voice again. And you still want to stay here as Brandi's guest? She asked. Stephanie felt a warm flush rise to her cheeks. You never think ahead, Mother, she said, with a tinge of frustration. Mrs. Hull lowered her gaze to hide the tears that were starting to gather in her eyes. She fidgeted with her handkerchief before speaking once more. Where is your father now? She inquired. He went back to Washington, Stephanie sighed. I assume he's at the office. A troubled expression crossed Mrs. Hull's face. He spends far too much time there, she remarked. Julian is no longer a young man. As much as I like Franklin McDermott, I can't shake the feeling that he's neglecting his responsibilities to your father, Stephanie. Please, Mother, no negative talk about Franklin. Stephanie placed a cautioning finger over her mother's lips. Mrs. Hull stared at her daughter in silence. A mother's love sharpened her normally distracted gaze, and she felt a dull ache in her heart as she noticed the dark circles under Stephanie's beautiful eyes and the pallor of her usually rosy cheeks. Suddenly, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Is everything okay between you and Franklin? She asked, with a hint of worry. Yes, Mother, Stephanie replied, though she turned her gaze away from her mother's concerned eyes as she stepped back from the embrace. Here comes Cousin Belle. Compose yourself. Mrs. Norby's entrance through the north door caught Mrs. Hull off guard, scrambling what little composure she had left. She stood in awe of her husband's cousin, a feeling she had never been able to shake over the years, and which had always kept their relationship at a distance. I noticed you'd arrived some time ago, Claire, said Mrs. Norby, delivering a perfunctory kiss to both of Mrs. Hull's cheeks. I waited for you in the library. My dear, I was completely out of breath. Mrs. Hull shook her head with a hint of dismay. When you reach my age, and well size, you'll understand, Belle, that I needed to rest in the nearest chair. Norby took pride in her appearance, and her smile in response to Mrs. Hull's comment carried a hint of sympathy. Julian should hire a chauffeur and let you use his car, she suggested. Come in, Claire, and take off your coat and hat. You must stay for dinner. Oh, I couldn't. But you absolutely must. Mrs. Norby's tone had just the right warmth, making Mrs. Hull glance helplessly at her quick-thinking daughter. Unfortunately, Stephanie chose to side with Mrs. Norby. Do stay, Mother, she pleaded, wrapping her arm around her waist as they walked through the north door, across the reception hall, and into the library. It will be wonderful to have you. Yet Mrs. Hull refused the chair her daughter guided her to. Instead, she turned to face Mrs. Norby with simple dignity. Stephanie just informed me of what occurred after Cousin John's will was read this afternoon, she began. Do you believe it is proper for Stephanie and me to remain as guests at 10 Acres? A quick expression shifted across Mrs. Norby's attractive face, but neither of her guests could decipher it. She stepped forward, placing a hand momentarily on Mrs. Hull's substantial shoulder. Any decisions regarding the probate of John's will be handled by our lawyers, she responded. If the will is contested, it will be a friendly legal matter. Personally, I believe Julian will reconsider and retract his rash threat. You know how impulsive he can be, Claire. Whatever reply Mrs. Hull might have made was interrupted by the entrance of Brandi. The girl was a favorite of Mrs. Hull's, who embraced her with genuine warmth. You don't look well at all, Brandi, she remarked bluntly, holding the girl at arm's length. Why don't you take a break somewhere, Belle? This gloomy atmosphere, she gestured around the somber room, is enough to depress even the strongest heart. Brandi smiled as she squeezed her hand, and then turned to her mother. Sam Jackson just called Starnes to say that neither he nor Dr. Curtis will be joining us for dinner, she informed. Really, Mrs. Norby raised her eyebrows in disapproval. And where have they gone? I don't know, Mother. Mrs. Norby settled into her favorite chair. Turn on the lights, Brandi, she said. We might as well get comfortable until dinner. 2 hours later, Brandi slipped away from the dining room and called the garage. A few words to Damison were all she needed, and she headed to the hall closet to grab her sport coat. The dinner had been surprisingly brief, and Brandi was grateful that it had gone more cheerfully than the meals since her uncle's passing. Franklin McDermott had arrived just before dinner, looking sharp in his evening attire. Mrs. Hull liked to think his charm came from her presence, but Starnes might have pointed out another reason for his sudden chatter. He would have noticed an empty cocktail shaker sitting in McDermott's bedroom. All day, Brandi had been battling a dull headache that left her yearning for escape. She craved solitude, perhaps even forgetfulness. Seizing the first chance she got, she slipped away, hoping her absence would go unnoticed until she was in her roadster and on the road. She opened the front door quietly and hurried down the veranda steps and along the driveway toward the lodge. A cab pulled up to the lodge gates, dropped off a passenger, and drove away. But Brandi's focus was on her car parked near the central driveway, and she didn't see the man walking slowly toward her. Her foot was on the running board when a hand landed on her shoulder. Brandi, Franklin McDermott's hot breath was too close for comfort. Where do you think you're going? For a drive. Then I'm coming with you, he said, his authoritative tone sending a shiver down her spine. Get in. She was in her seat in an instant, foot poised over the starter, but the engine was cold. In another moment, McDermott would be right next to her. Why hadn't she asked Damison to leave the engine running? In her rush, Brandi had turned on her headlights, and in their brightness, she spotted a man walking toward her. He moved confidently, his cane tapping rhythmically against the ground, his sightless eyes seemingly focused on the headlights. Brandi turned off the engine and leaned toward McDermott, who was perched on the running board. My fiancé, Dr. Curtis, is coming with me, she said. Please step down and make space for him. Then, leaning further out of the car, she called out, David. Hearing his name in her clear, gentle voice sent a thrill through Curtis, and he felt his heart race as he quickened his pace. It was the first time she had ever called him David, and for the first time in his life, he truly appreciated his name. What is it, Brandi? He replied, a hint of curiosity in his voice. Where are you? Stay to the right, she urged. I'm in my car waiting for you. She relaxed a bit as Curtis, feeling for the fender, made his way along the side of the car and came to a halt beside McDermott. You've won, Doctor, McDermott chuckled good-naturedly, making an effort to keep his tone light. If you'd been a second later, I might have joined Brandi. I'll explain things to your mother, Brandi. Goodbye now. With a playful wave, he strolled back toward the house. Curtis rested his hand on the door and climbed into the car. He didn't need to understand the whole situation. Brandi had called him, and that was enough. As he slammed the door shut, Brandi pressed her foot down on the accelerator, and in an instant, the gears engaged, sending the powerful roadster racing down the driveway and onto the Rockville Pike. It wasn't until then that Brandi finally spoke up. I had such a headache, she admitted. It was stuffy in the house, so I snuck out and I happened to come by, Curtis laughed, filled with relief. Thank goodness. Brandi shot him a look that was a mix of shyness and joy. She had been steeped in bitter, unhappy thoughts for so long that she welcomed this brief escape. Suddenly, she erupted in uncontrollable laughter. Oh, she gasped, managing to speak between fits of joy. You should have seen Franklin's face. You arrived just at the perfect moment. Thank you. No, it's I who should thank you for saving me from an unbearable situation. Her laughter faded quickly, replaced by a serious tone. I owe you a lot. Please don't, Curtis lightly placed his hand over hers for a moment. "I'm happiest when I can help you." His voice deepened, filled with emotion. "I hope you believe that." "I do," she replied, and Curtis's face lit up with a warm smile, his heart racing with an intensity he hadn't expected. He was too filled with happiness to say anything more, and for a while they travelled down the turnpike in comfortable silence. Every so often she stole a glance at her quiet companion, her critical eye taking in his broad shoulders and strong chest. He had removed his hat, allowing the breeze to touzle his naturally curly hair, which was typically so neatly styled. The stern expression that usually marked his features had softened, revealing the joy he found in their drive. In the dim glow of the dashboard lamp, he looked almost youthful. There was something about Curtis that inspired confidence in people of all ages, and Brandi felt her spirits lift as she drove the car at a slower pace through Rockville, and then onto the road toward Frederick, Maryland. "Are you okay with where we're going?" she asked, "or do you want to head back?" "Absolutely not," he replied with sincere enthusiasm. "Let's keep going. This road is great." "And believe it or not, there aren't many cars out tonight." Brandi leaned forward and turned on the headlights. "The stars aren't out. I wouldn't be surprised if a storm is coming." Once they were in open country, Brandi pressed down on the accelerator, and the car sped ahead. They passed a few other motorists, and then Brandi noticed a clear stretch of road ahead. The car raced onward, picking up speed as they approached the next hill. As they reached the top, Brandi noticed the ground suddenly dropped off into a steep incline, and she pressed down on the brake. Instead of slowing down, the roadster picked up speed. A frightened cry escaped her as the car lurched sideways, then righted itself and rushed down the hill like a bullet. "What's happening?" Curtis asked urgently. "The brakes aren't working," she gasped, yanking at the hand brake. "I've lost control." "Shift to second gear," he shouted. He could hear the grinding of the gears as he engaged the hand brake. Leaning over, he took hold of the wheel. "I'll keep it steady, just steer." He raised his voice again. "Is there anything up ahead?" "None." Her fingers wrapped around his as he turned the car in the direction she pointed, his grip firm on the wheel, keeping them in the center of the road. She felt their terrifying speed ease as they reached the bottom of the hill, hitting level ground, and she turned off the engine. The roadster coasted for a ways until she spotted a fork in the road ahead. "Turn right," she breathed. "We can pull over in the ditch." As the car came to a stop, Brandi slumped back in her seat. Curtis's voice seemed distant, and there were flickering lights in front of her eyes. "There's a box of ammonia vapor rolls in the right-hand pocket," she murmured weakly as her head drooped forward. "I'm so embarrassed." Her voice trailed off completely. The box was tucked at the bottom of the leather pocket in the door, and Curtis fumbled to find it. Crushing one of the little ampoules in his hand, he leaned over Brandi and held it near her face. She was still only half conscious when he lowered his hand to unfasten the high collar of her sport coat. As he pulled it back, his signet ring snagged on a delicate gold chain she wore around her neck, tucked beneath the front of her low-cut dress. As Curtis struggled to free his ring, the chain swung back, and its pendant hit his hand. It was a key. Without thinking, his fingers traced the slightly raised letters spelling Yale, then slid down the key. He counted each notch and groove automatically. A sharp breath escaped him. This key was identical to the one marked duplicate in Norby's safe deposit box. How had it ended up with Brandi? The long sigh from her snapped him back to the moment. Without hesitating, he pressed the catch on the chain and released the key. He tucked it carefully into his pocket, then slipped the chain back inside Brandi's gown. "Are you feeling better?" he asked as she lifted her head. "Yes," she struggled to sit up. "I can't believe I fainted. I'm so embarrassed." "You don't need to be," he replied quickly. "That was a dreadful run down the hill. We won't be able to drive this car back. Do you have any idea where we are?" "We've passed Gaithersburg," she said. "There's a farmhouse over in that field. We've stopped almost right in front of its gate." "Don't get out," he said urgently as she began to rise. She sank back down, aware that her legs felt weak. I can make it to the house and either call for a car to take us back to Rockville or ask someone there to drive us to Washington. They probably have a car. But what about my roadster? I'll call the nearest service station and have them send a tow truck for it, he said as he stepped out of the car. Don't worry, I won't be long. Brandi watched him walk slowly through the long grass toward the fence. Stay to the right, she called, and he waved back to show that he understood. She continued to watch him until a car from Rockville zoomed past and turned left. The house was at least a quarter-mile from the road, and Curtis moved cautiously. Brandi watched him anxiously until he disappeared into the shadows, then turned in her seat, only to be greeted by the sight of a masked man standing on her running board. She gaped at him in stunned silence. Slowly, his right hand came into view, revealing a revolver pressed against her chest. Don't make a sound, he ordered, his voice sounding menacing from behind the black cloth that concealed his face. Give me the key. The key. Yes, the key, he insisted, his tone sharp. Hurry, or I'll. The revolver pressed more firmly against her side. Automatically, Brandi pulled out her gold chain, letting it dangle as the light from the dashboard glinted off of it. She stared at the empty ring where the key had once been, as if entranced. It's gone, gone. The horror in her eyes when she looked back at the masked man was more telling than her words. Shouting voices from the farmhouse drew the masked man's attention away from Brandi and the empty chain. Like a shadow, he slipped into the night. Curtis called out, but received no reply. Climbing into the car with the farmer and his son, he discovered that Brandi had fainted again.